Hello, brave people. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so glad you're here because you belong here. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here is what I know. Everything in our social world is created through communication. That's the stories we tell, the way we show up to each other, and the patterns that we find ourselves in. And if we can take the time to understand all this, then we can start changing our communication and making better social worlds for ourselves, the kind that we actually want to live in. And that is exactly what we are going to do here in each of our conversations. Today we are talking to soon-to-be Dr. Aline Mugisho. Aline and I were connected through Kim Pierce, who of course is the president of our very own CMM Institute. Aline grew up in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and now lives in Nigeria, working for the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture as the executive manager for the Innovative Youth in Agriculture project. She works to empower young people and women in the field of sustainable agriculture by helping to provide new opportunities for innovation and growth. We will get to hear more about her work and her passion and the role that she sees this work having in the world in part 2 of our conversation. But today, in part 1, we're discussing the stories that shaped Aline's understanding of gender in both an empowering and disempowering way, how she learned resilience and fearlessness and became the person she is by seeing and experiencing pain and suffering, and what it looks like to fight for justice when inequality is baked into the very core of a society. This is a really meaningful conversation for me that left me with a lot to think about, so I'm hoping that you can take some value from this as well. Aline has some incredible stories to share about the things that she and the women in her community experienced and the ways they found to assert their dignity and still take care of everybody. I think her perspective is really helpful as we continue to learn more about ourselves, our communication, and how we want to create better social worlds. Please remember that you are just as much a part of this conversation as me or Aline, and that us getting to hear her story, us getting to hear anyone's real vulnerable story is a great honor, and it matters how we receive it. So get yourselves ready to do some reflecting, some learning, some growing. So with that, let's begin. Hi, Aline. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Abby. Thank you for the opportunity.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you today because, as you know, we've never spoken before outside of emails coordinating this. And what I do know about you comes from watching panels you've moderated, reading things that you've written, or Googling you. And I know that can never give me the full picture of who you are. So I'm wondering, from what people could learn about you online, what's something that's missing? What's important to know Aline?
What's important to know, Aline, is that I am very open, but also very private. And it's very often that people look at it from the perspective of, Aline is so open, And most of the time, sometimes people confuse the being open, to having that private moment. So when I'm in my private space, sometimes people feel, is she okay? It's, that's it's a kind of complicated personality trait, but something that I really, I don't know how to explain it to anybody, but I can be very open, bubbly, outgoing. And then at some point, I just want to be in a corner where I can reflect because I'm a very deep person. So I like to think, I dive deep into things to understand better my world or the world around me. Yes.
That's something I experienced too. I feel very open to share things about my life and, be authentic or vulnerable in that way of being honest about things I struggle with. But I think the way that I talked about it with a different guest that I had on is that they talked about their internal world. And it's I feel like I have I have a very rich internal world that I do like to spend time in thinking and, reflecting things that you're saying. And then also having this great, rich external world of great relationships and communities getting to be a part of.
Yes, it's very important. I believe it's a good way of not only understanding yourself better, but also digesting everything that you've taken in. Because this is very important, right? In understanding, in making better social world, you need to understand that there's so much things that you may not have taken into consideration in a single episode of a conversation, you know? And there's some conversation you want to take a follow-up on, but you really want to go deep inside and understand yourself. Where am I, you know, in relation to this person? So that's very interesting. That internal world is when you're like somebody like me that is often very open and out there all the time. By out there, I'm not just talking about being in panels and conferences, but I'm constantly outside my house, you know. I could say I spend sometimes just a week in every 2 months sometimes in my house. It can happen that you come to a point where you've taken in a lot, and there's a very important role you can play in that world, but you need to check in with yourself.
Yeah.
Because in that understanding, in that passion, in that motivation, there's just so much that you could still miss out on, you know, or you could be even running the danger of being too dispersed.
Yeah.
You know, so that's check-in moments, that's closing time is something that I really find precious. I always simplify it in telling people that I like to work in a noisy place, but I cannot live in a noisy place.
Yeah, you have to have both. And I think it's something you have to be intentional about, because I think there's so much noise everywhere all the time. Even when you're alone, you know, now we have our phones and it's more noise that's seeking your attention. You know, you were putting your phone in airplane mode before this because things are going to pop up asking for your attention. And so you really have to be intentional about trying to create that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's very interesting that you said there's so much noise everywhere. You know, when you've been so much engaged in so many different worlds, and then you come back to yourself, like that time you get either your room or your office from a very long meeting or conference or a trip somewhere.
Yeah.
And then you get home and you say, oh, I just want to rest, right? And you close your eyes and your brain is 100% active. There's so many questions, there's so many thoughts, there's so many ideas, there's a lot of ways in which you want to express, you know, in which you want to locate yourself within everything that you've just learned on that day or in that period. It's so amazing that you said there's so much noise around. Yeah. And then, of course, there is all these technologies around us and the world problems, because we don't live in a bubble, you know. We do live in a community, in a society, in a country, in a continent, you know, in situations. And those things can become a very important part of our social world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in starting to get deeper into your story, I'd let you know that Kim shared with me that you had to leave your home because of the Civil War and you were a student journalist. And she said that's something that has, you know, really shaped your direction in life, as I assume that it would. Is that a story that you want to tell more of today, or is there a different way that you want to enter into this conversation?
It is, but it's a very important part of my life, and it has been very much part of my narrative, right? It's the first time I had to leave my home country alone and go to another country without direction. And I will unpack that. It's not like I had a visa or I had my passport with me or I had all that it takes to have a coherent journey. And I wasn't a student journalist. Like, I was still a student, but I was working as a journalist. I started working when I was just 14, and I was running some kids programs. I mean, not kids program, but some radio programs on justice, especially gender equality, advocating for a girl-child space in society, in my society. I'm from Eastern DRC. And the country has been so unstable for many, many years. And when I was recently with my mom and we were reflecting on the war in Congo, I was saying something with my cousin about when war started in Congo. She said, no, this actually didn't start then. The country has been under a non-systemic function, right? So from our problems we've had with dictatorship from the Mobutu regime, we quickly dropped from there into a rebellion. And then through that coup d'etat, Mobutu was overthrown. And we had a slight moment of calm, you know, before we could even finish that transition. The next leader was assassinated. And then the country collapsed into a conflict, right? And it has been like that since 1996. At the same time, the neighboring countries were also going through some very strong challenges. 1994, it was the Rwandan genocide. You know, my family home in DRC is just at the border of Rwanda. And that was very important that I go through that process, you know, without having to struggle. I wanted to go through that process, understanding as a child what it means to see other children fleeing their homes, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, from the perspective of my parents and our lives, it was also a moment where we needed to understand what it really meant to share your space with other people. You know, it was the time for you to understand how to open up your doors to receive a stranger that you do not know. And that's just a crossroad of, you know, different events that happened around that period. So the war erupts, and then we quickly shift from violence and war into extreme sexual violence against girls and women. And until sexual violence was then eventually used as a weapon of war. And all those processes were shaping a lot what society became at the time, right? And then, of course, technology is starting to get in. So we from the town or the city, we didn't have a sense of the reality of what is happening in the rural areas, you know, until that period that you have to travel all the way on those bad routes without proper network, no GPS coordinate, to understand what is really happening on the other side, and then come back and give that account to the people who are living in the city. There was no way we could build solidarity, you know, and stop that, what was happening in the rural areas, unless somebody stood in the gap, yeah, and brought the information from the rural areas to the town. I mean, today it is very different. Of course, anybody, even in rural areas, are using a smartphone. So it's easier for them to record things, drop them on social media, somebody to pick up on them and be able to move them to a different space. So it has been very challenging, very difficult, and of course, very complicated for us as a society to be able to undertake that. And for me particularly, I was born in a family of 5 girls, right? And I don't know how well you understand about families without a male in Africa. I don't know how much of that you know, but I can tell you for sure, in the family of my father, my mother was considered a failure just by having girls, right? And in our family, it wasn't as complicated because my father was totally in love with his girls and he was very happy and he was highly educated. My mom too. So family-wise, it wasn't a complicated thing for my father to say, don't get involved. These are my children. They are mine. I remember him literally telling that to some of my aunties, that I didn't come to you to ask you if I could have borrowed any of your boy children because I was struggling with my own girls. No, these are my people. These are my children. I love them. I don't see them as boys. I don't see them as less. I don't see them as smaller than others. So either you respect them or I don't want to see you ever into my house. I remember eavesdropping into that conversation, once one of my aunties was trying to influence my dad to take a second wife because my mom could not give him a male child. And that was really complicated. For us growing up, it was easy, they would throw it in your face. Like you want to speak something into some of those family gatherings, somebody would just drop out a word like, oh, what can you even say? You guys, your father would be buried without a name behind. Those kind of things. So it was a kind of accepted abnormalities in the society, to put that girl child very much down, without thinking. And for me, it was totally out of order. You should not put people down like that. So when I got the opportunity to do this event, and of course it was during I don't know if you know much about the campaign from UNICEF called All Girls in School. I don't know if it was a worldwide campaign or it was an African-led campaign. Mm-hmm. But it was because the economic situation was very crucial, right? So if the family had to sacrifice one of the people who would not go to school, that would be a girl.
Right.
And because girls were not considered as family assets, right? So girls were considered as children, of course, but children that would leave the family home and go and get married somewhere else. So it didn't make sense if you have only girls for you as a man to claim ownership of your children, because once they get married, the idea is that they belong to the family where they have married into. Mm. And of course, that was a challenge, a very deep challenge for us to be able to go through that. And so it was really a challenge to overcome. And I got involved into, from my work, my school, I was selected to go and represent my school somewhere into a debate on peace building and gender equality. Of course, it wasn't put like that. It was more about sensitization, right? So they asked me what is the idea that I would defend if I wanted to. And I said the idea that I would defend is one where a young girl can be considered as an equal human being or as a human being. And that's the human rights. They don't limit themselves to the ability of having a boy in a family. They limited themselves. They expand to girls, And we shouldn't be the ones that would suffer the consequences of society when everything goes wrong, or to be blamed for that matter. So that's how eventually I got involved into a career, and that's how I started working with the media, and until things got really rough, of course, because those atrocities are committed by some people, right? Reporting that there's this level of sexual violence and putting it out there, both to the national and international community, was threatening certain interests. So it's a very, very difficult conversation that I don't think I want to dig deep into, but more or less that how I had to flee at some point, because I also lost a lot of friends and colleagues. I lost the journalist that was working for even the UN radio, a friend of mine, two of them. I saw a lot of my other colleagues surviving threats every day, because I was really at the crossroad of civil society and journalism. So like an advocacy, or if I can call it like that, journalists, It was really a very complicated situation to go through. But the only way was to leave. And living as a child, it was the very first reality that the world is not kind for me at that time, right? I mean, you don't even get to say goodbye to your sisters, right? You don't get to say goodbye to your family. And then in that process, once you've now survived and you're starting to understand yourself better, where am I now? You lose your mom. I felt both heaven and earth was not being just on me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I felt I did nothing wrong, but I keep going through very much difficult situations, But at that moment, I also discovered a better me, I built myself not only into a survivor personality, but into a fearless person, I wasn't afraid of anything. I felt I had reached the epic level of fear. Yeah. So that's how I got to start, by road, actually, moving from one country to another until I found myself in South Africa. And eventually there I applied for asylum. And at the same time, I was studying and I was going through some life changes, But it was not an easy thing to survive in that society, Yeah, I'm going to just stop it there.
Something I spend a lot of time thinking about is we have this great goal of creating better social worlds. And the way we talk about this is, all about this personal power that we have to create the kind of world we want and participate. And then you have to figure out where into that fits these stories and these experiences that are outside of our control. And I think a lot about that, especially with children, of not being able to consent or choose to so many things that happen to children, and even, extending to your experience when you're a teen, of even just within family, you don't choose the way your parents raise you, society, culture, you don't choose the way that people have seen women for generations. You didn't ask to be born into that. You didn't ask to be placed in a war. You didn't ask to have to leave your home. And so I think it's interesting how that relates to each other. How do you balance this? There's so much outside of our control. And then there's also so many choices you get to make. And, learning how to relate to those stories that you didn't choose. Because what I'm hearing from you, is it's probably not something you choose to go through again. And now you can still see the ways it made you fearless, the ways it shaped you into the person you are today.
Yeah, partly I would say, because for me, I continued to have that thought, right? Because there's a component of this conversation that I need to share with you, or this reflection on justice, especially when you speak about gender justice, right? In an African context. Women in this continent are the ones that are holding the continent. Informally or formally, I would justify myself. I grew up around women who had employment, which means they worked at an official institution. My mom worked for the post office, right? And so did my dad. Not for the post, but for another institution. I have aunties and uncles who worked for the government, for private sector, for the NGO world. And throughout that period, none of those women, and I mean none, only survived through the formal way in which they were making an income. In DRC, we had a dictatorship and violence, as I told you. So we moved from a totally no system that was very oppressive into a system that became, and through which actually nobody in government received their salary. We moved from month and month and month of arrears, right? Salary arrears, or years and years. I think to date, my mom still has like 20-something years of her salary that was never paid.
Whoa.
Yes.
Wow.
And that same process applies for most people who have worked for government. They would get a bit of salary, but it's not what they have signed up to get, you know? They don't have enough. In some countries, it's worse than the others. And I think in Congo, it was really worse because we had the Mobutu regime that was totally corrupt, terrible system. And then we moved through the Kabila regime that was totally unstable with the war and violence in many places of Eastern DRC, and insecurity increased. So even those women who were doing businesses, it became impossible for them to make a peaceful living, right? Military insurgency and rebel movement took over routes, roads, situation. Rape became the weapon of war, you know. Women, even in that way, trying to go and make a living, they were now being raped, violently so, brutally so, right? But they didn't look at rape as something that would stop them. They would be raped today. They would survive the rape if they managed to survive it and it didn't destroy them. Tomorrow morning, they will still go to the farm. They will get something to eat and they will go back to give their children. And in that process, a lot of us accessed quality education. A lot of young men and women accessed quality education. And because of that quality education we accessed, we were able to now access a different world, you know, other than the world in which we grew up. And that started to make us understand that the system in which we grew up was actually not a system that was organized.
Yeah.
And then you come to the second part in Europe or in the US. And you're now seeing the world from a different perspective, totally different world, right? Where everything is regularized, everything is structured, you know, it's amazing. But when you see how women fight for rights in the US, there's even a framework they can go through. That was not possible in DRC or in many African countries, whether under apartheid or under civil war in some or under dictatorship in others. Life was simply not simple. But those women never, ever in 1 second thought that they would close their hands, they would keep quiet and stay home waiting for some miracle to happen. They made the miracle. They are the miracle. So it's really the first part that triggered my understanding of women resilience, women protection, and gender equality, gender transformation. You know, I felt nobody can tell that better to an African woman than an African woman.
Mm-hmm.
Even me, I wouldn't say that I'm not as closely brave to those women. They carry 50 kilos, you know, on their back just to walk more than 60 kilometers to go to the market and back from the market. Sometimes 20 kilometers. They will start the journey very early in the middle of the night to make it there. These women, like my mom, owned informal business, formal businesses outside of their normal official tasks and raising 5 children in the process, right? And in Africa here, your children are not your only responsibility. You have the children of your sisters and so on, you know, the cousins that may come by, depending on where the best opportunities are, and sends them to school without a salary. But she was even much far better. Look at those who were selling small things in the market on the walkways. It would be really you know, amazing. They would dress maybe one piece of clothes or two. They never afforded any luxury, and they will make sure their children are still accessing the education that will make them compete to the rest of the world. If Africa is open to the world today, we owe it to those women. Those are powerful machines that continue to run this continent. Secondly, I think it's safe enough to say that those women didn't wait for somebody to come. They didn't wait for the NGOs to come or for somebody to come from the US, from Europe to save them. They took their own initiatives and built something that is an alternative that to date is still not recognized fully. When we put English to it, we call it informal trade. Informal mechanisms, strategies. We downgrade it to the waste level because it doesn't fit in the system of us understanding that is pure resilience, that is pure empowerment, that is pure capacity development right there, Nobody taught them how to do it. They did it on their own. So for me, it is actually a very disrespectful method if we would not first recognize who those women are and how they have resiliently made our world a better place. And that's just the story of my community, of the many people, of the cultures around me. I saw this in South Africa. I saw this with migrant communities I worked with. I saw this with asylum seekers, women who were doctors, but who could not apply their qualification in their host countries. I saw them selling fruit on the street. I saw them in the street of Johannesburg or Cape Town or Durban, trying to fight for a space just to make ends meet. That's what made me focus my thesis on women resilience. Their own perspective of what they understand as protection is broadly linked to their level and thoughts and efforts of survival daily,
Yeah, you're giving me so many things to think about, and the lens that I'm seeing or hearing what you're saying through is that we all have stories and narratives, whatever, that we internalize growing up throughout our lives, whatever, that shape us in ways that we, maybe can't understand until we do take the time to do some of that reflecting. And, it sounds like these are those stories for you that got built one by one, little by little. It's these like very critical moments are the small moments that shaped, your understanding of what you could be or what's wrong in the society, what you want to see changed, the way you saw women demonstrate resilience or strength or independence in all of these little ways. And it's not something they're maybe trying to do. They're not saying, I'm going to get out of bed today and do all of these things so that Aline can believe in the strength of women. It's just something that happens, I think.
It's a very natural process.
Yeah, it's something I think is good when we can intentionally think about the stories we're trying to pass on and create. But like you're saying, it's natural. You can't always know the effect you're going to have. And so you have that, I think valuable practice of being able to reflect on the ways that things have shaped you and, what you want to carry on from that and what you kind of need to leave behind. Because I feel like I also have this I have this communication perspective, I think that's kind of central to the way that I see the world. And then the other layer of that is this, using this lens of gender to understand how people's experiences change so much based on their gender. And that does, vary by culture, but in a number of different ways, I see, gender as being such a big influence. And it sounds like, you've seen that to in terms of the stories that shaped you?
Definitely. And beside that, there is also the component of living through the stories of others, right? And also understanding the power they hold, the weakness, the struggles they're going through. And for me, when you were speaking, a thought came through to me. And that thought is about how and at what point do we start to feel the impacts of the society around us, you know? Because for me, I have moved from working and fighting for gender equality into fighting for youth inclusion. Mm-hmm. And I see a reproduction of a very much unjust system. It almost like there was an architecture of inequality that was built, and layers of it are manifesting in different ways. Yeah? So if you look at youth inclusion, so many young people are struggling to have access to really anything today. Employment, funding, those who are starting their businesses, creating a space. Of course, I'm not going to say that nothing has changed, but for my society, I'm going back to Congo, to Africa. Just a few days ago, I was in Nigeria, and a few weeks ago, I was in the US, or in between the US and Europe. Just even look at me and you. We're young, and who are the people who support us? There are those people that we know that have been old or that have a certain age, and they want to make sure that they see us successful, right? In a way, they pass on concepts, platforms, and so on to us for us to explore, and they stay back a little bit to give us the support required for that, right? Now, being a young girl that has gone through injustice, I see a reproduction of a society that is like, you shouldn't even have come out from there and have children, because these your children, there's this misconception that they just don't have as much a future as you didn't have as a woman. You know what I mean? Probably not. I've spoken about a system of injustice, right? Where people were not paid their salary, where the functionalities, the economies of society was in the hands of a very small group of people. And a society that even to look for a single paper, you still have to bribe, you still have to go through a lot of hassle to get anything really. Now you come to a society where you're now young, your mother has battled, your parents have suffered to get you a degree, but you cannot have an employment. Why? Because nobody is being retired. They don't want to leave those positions of comfort. They're holding on to it because society was not functioning to give alternative to those people who are stuck into the system, hoping one day justice will come and they will get back something that has been taken, stolen from them over time. Those unpaid salaries in various places across the continent are not going to be paid today. They're not going to get that money now. But their hope is that if they go home, the screams of poverty and violence and economic struggles are way too many at home. So it's better they stay in that office. So as a young person, you meet somebody like that who has both the fear of the society he's going back to if he was to retire, right? My mom is retired, right? And she's living to give contributions to many other people. But in this society where I am right now, I have people who struggle to even coach a young person. I have trust that is not given to a young person. You know, I have situations where a young person has this brilliant idea, but they're not getting somebody to hold them tight, to believe in that dream, to take them to the next level. You know, the system has not been developed to include them. You go to look for a loan at the bank, they want your credit record, but who's going to build a credit record for you?
Yeah, you have to have, someone, it seems, in a position like you are now to be, I don't know if you'd consider yourself like a mentor to children or someone on their team to help make these connections for them. Because, like you said, it's the architecture. It's baked in this like inequality.
Exactly.
And so it seems so big that, the issues are part of the system. Does that feel debilitating to you? Like, where do you start?
It's overwhelming. I work in agriculture. And when I tell you that I feel like I have just graduated from one center of injustice into another center of injustice, is here the struggle is real, right? Today, of course, in the US, these things have changed. You have all this startup, grants and so on. You have supports that you can get from the government and so on. That's not the case here in Africa. Now, you can have those grants from the bank sometimes. But as a young person, you are expected to give a collateral. Where is it going to come from? For somebody who's trying to create an enterprise, they ask you to give a collateral that could be your father's house, making more than 7 other siblings, including your parents, vulnerable in case that business collapses. Mm. There is no offer for an alternative. There's no transition plan for the youth. When you finish to study, that you can go into this stream of employment that will help you to start building your career, your experience slowly, that will share the experience between the elderly ones and those that are younger ones, to be able to get to a level where they could get, a profile built. Okay, so they want to create their own employment to entrepreneurship, right? Whether it's social entrepreneurship or small and medium enterprises. The first battle they will meet is the lack of trust from their elders. And that elders could be also big companies who don't believe at a single minimum in their ability to perform, because they never performed. How can they believe that these people who came from them are going to perform, right? They're yet to catch up on the technology to understand that young people have gone out there. Those that have gone out there, some of them have brought something back home. They want to see that change happen right here. They're hustling every day to see that change happen. But to some, it's not even a choice. They have no other option. They don't have a job. They can never go to any place to access an employment. You understand? So it's very difficult for them. And when they want to start, let's say if they want to start a business in agriculture, the sector in which I am today. When I was talking to my mom, I was saying food in the US, in the Western world, is over-processed. Food in Africa is under-processed.
What do you mean by that?
Under-processed means there's so many other sub-products you can pick out of a value chain, food value chain. So, let me just say a simple thing. If you look at a banana, there's so many sub-products you can develop as part of with a banana as a raw material, because the industry is there. The industry has been developed to create those additional products. So if you are a banana plantation owner, right, you have chances to get people all over to come and collect your bananas. Here, more likely, you will get people who will come and buy those bananas, but they will sell them in supermarkets or on the street. Those that end up spoiled in the street, who is using them? Nobody. Yeah? So you feel, if I'm not using this, nobody else is using it. But there's no industry, there's no electricity, there's no machinery, there's no mechanized labor. So chances even that you could develop some sub-product, alternative product, are very, very minimal. Then you have the youth that come up with very creative ways of doing that. There is a development that took place, and I was evaluating this development recently when somebody was saying, oh, but young people now can access funding if they form in groups. So because I'm young, I must just go and collect 10 different entrepreneurs that I don't even know who they are, what is their business discipline, to come so that I can be able to just access funding. And when I have that funding, because the dream was not similar, I still am vulnerable and I'm left with a credit for a bank that I cannot pay because I was part of a group. Then I'm blacklisted. And then what happens?
Well, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Aline, but don't you worry, there will be a part 2, so be sure to join us next week for that, where we'll be talking about how Aline is directly working to create a better social world for so many people right now and in the future. Today, our next turn, which of course is how we move on from this conversation and let it impact us and the social world we're creating, is to share this podcast with someone in your life who could use it. Maybe it's someone who would be excited by these kinds of conversations and topics. Maybe it's someone who's struggling to create the kind of social world they want. Maybe it's someone who is lacking a safe community to learn the value of their story. Everyone belongs here, and I hope that we can only keep expanding and welcoming more voices and unique stories into this space. So invite someone into this conversation today. As always, I get to do this podcast with support from the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. We share the same goals of reflecting on our communication, learning the power of storytelling, and working to make better social worlds. I'll link their website so you can check out all the amazing things that they have going on. If you enjoy this episode, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It only takes 1 second to do and is super, super helpful for me to get more people connected to the podcast. So follow us wherever you may be listening so you never miss an episode. And of course, you're as much a part of this podcast as I am, so pretty please email me at storieslive.storiestold@gmail.com to keep the dialogue alive. You know I love to hear your questions and ideas for the podcast and whatever stories you want to share, since this is the space for safe story sharing. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious and brave. And thank you for being a part of this story. That's all for today. Come back next week for part 2 with Aline, and in the meantime, keep creating mindful moments. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.